Hi again. Uh, in that evening, I will speak about the last chapter of my book, Hypnosis in the Realm of Design. So I'm grateful for all of you because you not only give likes but commented some of my considerations of this book. I hope you are well and with peace and health. So, the last chapter is named Transmodernity, a term derived from Faruk Saif's idea of transmodernity. This chapter is a way of thinking that try to emphasize the idea of things and objects, but in a design thinking perspective. I begin this chapter mentioning a very famous song we have here in Brazil, O Índio, the Indigenous, by Caetano Veloso. And it begins telling about an Indian who comes in a very technological nave, and he comes from the stars to say something important for us. It's a very beautiful song, and it has many connections with this book in general. Perhaps mainly because it's considered a particularity of a human being as a multiple being. The human self, in the semiotic self, is not only an individuality, it's a multiple connections of semiotic systems. So, as some authors considers, Charles Peirce, for example, didn't deny the individuality, but he considered we have all forms of semiotic systems that inhabit in ourselves. And this is important. Why? Because we think in transmodernity we are considering the possibility to establish a more emphatic and precise dialogue with this other voice, memories, and beings that inhabit ourselves, as it's happened in many moments of our history. For example, with the Greeks. For example, more recently, the double mans in French history of mesmerism and somnambulism, for example, mediumship. And as we can verify in many traditional cultures for whom we are always in connections with other kind of beings, of invisible beings in the world. I'm not speaking on religion, but I'm speaking of a cosmovision, a form of understanding our nature as a plural being, which do not lose its individuality, but maintain many forms of connection. And with our all voices, our all ancestors, the spirits of our culture, the invisible beings of our culture, the familiar meetings, the familiar beloveds, and etc., etc. So, how could you think in transmodernity? The first step is perhaps the idea of integration as discussed by Farouk Saif, ethos and integration. Because if we are not only the Cartesian men and women who are always individuals who thinks, but we are complex beings with multiple voices and especially feelings, we can connect with these universes in order to learn how to develop as wisdom concerning the world, concerning our lives. This is a form of thinking which requires the necessity to look and to search for ourselves, an inquiry into ourselves, but not only as an introspection, but as a form to consider the world from a sensitiveness and a feeling, an imaginary perspective. In this sense, Farouk Saif speaks on rebirth, renewal and rebirth. And this makes sense because when we are looking inside out, from inside to out, we can perceive the world in a very, very different perspective. Someone can call this spirituality, and I agree with it, because spirituality is not the worship toward a god or a religion ritual. Spirituality is a form, in my point of view, to consider the world from this perspective, an aesthetic perspective, which of course implies the notion of sacred, for example, but not restricted to a ritual. In this sense, we are very closer to which Ayrton Krenak, a famous Brazilian philosopher who is also indigenous, in which he says that the future is ancestor, in a very close perspective with Farouk's idea, in which we can have future memories, not only because we can think about a polychronic time in its circularity, but we can project and see ourselves and our ancestors with their windows toward the future, but live in this at this moment, as if we could speak with them, as if we could interact and learn with them. So this idea of a future which is also ancestor is teleologic, and it's not possible in a very linear perspective of time, but a form to understand the world, understand our existence as a moment in a much more complex and polychronic cycle. In the sense, it's a form to return to reenchantment, to consider world, especially and mainly through beauty, even with our tragedies, even with wars, or despite them, the suffering, the inegalities, and the things that are in the roots of our suffering. But despite this, despite all the things are present, we can see something beautiful which favorize the renewal of our hopeness toward the world. In this sense, transmodernity is possible and perhaps necessary when we see and watch today many kinds of wars, of lives who goes on, of lives which seems for many others they don't care, of hungry, of misery, of many kinds of injustice. But when we make this little turn in ourselves, perhaps we can see much more than this and find some lights of hopeness. In the sense, taking again the song I mentioned in the beginning from our poet Caetano Veloso, the indigenous come from the stars with a very high technology, very superior technology. He comes and go to America in the south, and after all destruction, the genocide concerning the traditional people, the forests, the animal, the rivers, and everybody will be surprised about what will he speaks and teach us, and will not speak something very extraordinary. We will not speak something transformative, very different or strange concerning our thoughts, but he will only speak on the obvious, and the others can teach a lot for us. Thank you very much, and I hope see you again in next meetings. Bye bye.